Hello, this is the second in a series of 6 lectures on research, choosing a range of sources. As usual, you will hear some pages flipping and you might even hear some cats meowing, but you will definitely hear me telling you a little bit about sources. Hello, this is the second in a series of 6 lectures on research. In the first lecture, I described where information can be found. You can consult other people who have unique expertise. You can go to a specialized collection, a physical location where books and papers are stored. You can go to a privately funded space or a publicly funded space like a library, which is patronized by an educated, literate populace, made possible by the invention of the printing press. Or you can go to the internet, which is a linked digital resource of many separate streams of information supported by both public and private funding. Now, as per usual in this lecture, you will hear some pages flipping because I am reading. And you will also potentially hear some cat noises because my cats are goofing around next to me. Okay, so for now, I want to describe 4 kinds of information that can be either primary or secondary, scholarly or non-scholarly. These are the sources: primary or secondary, scholarly or non-scholarly. We're also going to talk about the shelf life of accuracy. Will time change the accuracy of this information? We're also going to look a little bit at peer reviewing and ask ourselves, which peers are we talking about? And I'm going to remind you to follow the money. Primary information is information that comes at the time from people who are eyewitnesses. It is also the first set of recollections or documents written about an event. For the assassination of Martin Luther King, primary data would be composed of any eyewitnesses, any newspaper reporting on it, and the first TV news anchor reporting on the assassination. All of these would constitute primary data. Primary information on the Titanic would include things like copies of the menu or copies of a ticket, letters that were sent by people who were on the Titanic, or possibly the ship's planned sailing itinerary. It would also be things like the first written testimony of the ship going down and the newspaper reports that were written about the sinking at the time. All of these are what we would call primary data. Secondary data is what happens after a little time has passed and people want to reflect on and gather up the primary sources. For Martin Luther King, a secondary source might be a biography by someone who collected the primary evidence of his life and what happened on that day and made a conclusion about why he was assassinated. Secondary sources are compiled by people who are trying to take a certain amount of measured perspective. We use primary sources to offer authority on a subject. We want to know what the person on the spot thought and believed and did. Primary documents make the subject vivid, memorable. Secondary sources allow us to collect judgments that can be made more clearly once time has passed. Secondary sources inform history and policy. It's also true that Martin Luther King's life and death have been incredibly important for America, even for the members of his own family. There are many secondary sources on Martin Luther King, and new research occasionally turns up a new story. Historians are always on the lookout for a new primary source. And some topics generate an endless amount of retelling because we find that event to be a cultural touchstone, and we need to understand ourselves in the light of this event. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is one such cultural event, which we have told and retold because it helps us to understand ourselves and our own dilemmas. Most recently, civil rights and policing were brought to the fore by the death of George Floyd. And in some sense, Martin Luther King and that story is the story that sets the tone for future civil rights stories. We turn to secondary research to argue about the meaning of history and to make policy. Some subjects are so compelling that they are investigated over and over again. Historians may actually dig up new primary information to expand their secondary information. To take the Titanic, once the Woods Hole Oceanographic Research Association found the wreck, there were more visits to the wreck and new artifacts were brought up. At the bottom left, you'll see a little bracelet for a child with a name on it, Amy. These are primary resources that shed new light on the original event. In a way, they became part of the industry of telling the story of the Titanic. Not long after the Titanic went down, people started making money on telling the story of the Titanic. So there are primary and secondary sources on the Titanic, and then there are people who are using the story for profit or for interest. For instance, you can find food historian and YouTuber Max Miller. His work in the Titanic menus is really kind of fabulous, and they're a group of enthusiasts who are interested in all things Titanic. Of course, some developments are more troubling, like the submersible tourism industry, which generated a whole new disaster for the Titan. Let's dig into this concept, scholarly and non-scholarly, some more. Scholarly sources are peer-reviewed. Peer reviews help to make sure that information is not skewed or inaccurate. Medical journals, like the Journal of the American Medical Association, for instance, rely on reviewers to ensure that what they publish is accurate and safe. They very often take considerable trouble to show that the work is scholarly and that the information is verifiable. Peer-reviewed means that other experts have looked at this piece of writing and have decided that the information in it is both accurate and disinterested, meaning nobody is paying for this work in a way that makes the research tilted or crooked. There is no private or personal interest that can be published as truth, because if that happens, that can ruin the reputation of the journal and the trust people put into it. And as you see, this is a particular article that is investigating this very problem of interest or self-interest in a journal like JAMA. So when you're doing research, it's always a good idea to follow the money. Research can be produced in an interested or a disinterested way. Check if someone has paid for or expects a particular result and is leaning on the researcher to create that result. In addition to being honest, scholarly work stands the test of time. A newspaper reporter doesn't have time to investigate everything before the deadline. He or she cannot check every fact. The shelf life of that kind of information is relatively short. But a history of the life and times of Martin Luther King shouldn't change too much. It should have complete information that isn't really radically altered by future historical investigative work. It might be, but we really don't expect that so much. Now, the same is true of the central image, the Riverside Shakespeare. That is a book, an edition that collects all of the variant examples of Shakespeare's plays and puts them together so that you can compare them. And if you want to read them, you kind of can know what he really meant. Shakespeare scholars use this book as a kind of Shakespeare Bible. Now, the right image is the image of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which has been a standard source of information for more than 100 years. So these are different versions of being peer-reviewed and being accurate over time. Scholarly work is often collected and packaged and sold to universities and libraries. Not everything that is scholarly is relevant, though. It's up to the student to do some thinking and to understand what he or she is actually reading and how it can be useful in research. Non-scholarly sources are not necessarily inaccurate. They simply don't live in the academic realm of verification. A non-scholarly source about the Titanic might be someone like Max Miller, who's actually very well informed and accurate, but he's not part of an academic circle. It doesn't do to dismiss these kind of non-academic sources as being not good enough. Sometimes someone develops an expertise which is outside of the academic realm, but which is nevertheless solid and real. Max started out as a cruise ship performer, but he has become, through effort and attention and research, an expert in his field. Here are two others that I happen to like. One is The Kitten Lady, and The Kitten Lady is a woman who started out just showing how to manage and care for kittens, and she's actually become something of an expert on how to care for really, really little kittens. The guy on the right, Mark Rober, worked for NASA, and then he ended up becoming a YouTuber who put together all kinds of fun science videos. These people are entertainers, but both of them have some significant expertise. So even though someone may be outside of academics, doesn't mean that they aren't accurate or can't offer us interesting and useful information. There are, however, some things to look out for in dealing with non-scholarly work, and that's advocacy or profit. For good or for ill, if someone has a message or an argument that they must make and stands to make money or has a moral position, you need to look at the research carefully before using it. And I've got two examples here, the World Wildlife Federation and ExxonMobil. These are both people who do research, but they're also people that you should look at a second time before you use it. So finally, here is an example of a research project that you might do and the ways that you might use research, primary, secondary, scholarly, non-scholarly. So if you were asked to do research on the clothing recycling industry, how would you figure that out? What would you do? Well, first, you might want to talk to somebody who's in the business, so you might interview somebody if you could. You might look up interviews that were kind of direct sources, and then you might actually visit a store or conduct your own interview. You could do that if you wanted to know a little bit about the primary business of doing this work. You would talk to somebody who's doing it. And then you could also go look for interviews and press releases. These are still kind of primary stuff, but it sort of shades into secondary. So you would look at reports on the industry or a state of the industry report, and you might specifically look for what's called a white paper, which usually describes policy. So you could get primary, you could get secondary, you can get non-scholarly, and you can get scholarly, all about the topic of clothing recycling. And you would put them together, and you would set the stage and tell the story with the primary data, and you would try to argue for new understandings and new recommendations with your secondary information. And so that's an example of application. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to giving you the next one.